This project is a collaboration with one of my favourite woodworkers and YouTubers, John Heisz of I Build It. A while ago I mentioned in one of my videos that I'd love to work with John, and to my surprise he got in touch and we discussed some ideas. The idea that we settled on was to design and build a chair using only one sheet of plywood. We are both releasing our build videos at the same time, and you'll find a link to John's build video in the description box below, as well as links to his YouTube channels. I was hoping to use some nice furniture grade birch plywood for this build, but it's really expensive here in the UK, so instead I settled on some Far Eastern hardwood 18mm ply, and I picked it up at my local timber merchants, and I got them to rip the sheet lengthways roughly down the middle just so that I could fit it into my van and also through my house and out to the workshop. If you're new to my channel, you may not know that practically everything I make is from salvaged materials. This is one of the exceptions, as while I have a fair bit of salvaged plywood, I didn't have enough that matched that I could use for this project. First I needed to design the chair that I wanted to build, and that was a lot of work in itself, so I'll be uploading a separate video about how I designed the chair. Meanwhile, this video is focusing on the build itself. Full 3-dimensional plans and a cut list will be available for this project via my Patreon page in case anyone watching wants to have a go at building one of these chairs for themselves. I'd start by making the two rectangles that form the arms of the chair. Before I could make any cuts at the table saw, I first needed to cut the plywood down even more to get the pieces to a size that I could manage with in my small workshop, so I used my circular saw to make some rough cuts, which were slightly oversized. And then I could use my panel sled at the table saw to cut the pieces accurately to the lengths I needed. Then I set my table saw fence and ripped the pieces to width based on the measurements from my drawing. So now I had 8 pieces in total, 2 longer and 2 shorter pieces for each of the 2 rectangles. I decided to just use wood glue and screws for what would be the bottom of each arm assembly, as these screws wouldn't be visible on the bottom of the chair. After marking up positions for the screws, I added the glue and used a speed square to keep the corners at 90 degrees. I could then drill pilot holes with the countersinking bit and add some 50mm screws. I used a knife blade to scrape away the excess glue. Next I added the top panel for the arms, just with glued butt joints initially. I made sure to get the edges nice and flush, clamped them in place and put them out in the sun so that the glue would dry quicker. I then wanted to reinforce those butt joints with some dowels, and I'd used some 40mm long, 10mm wide beech dowels for this. To get all of the dowels spaced nice and consistently, I decided to make a simple jig out of a scrap of plywood cut to the same width as the arms of the chair. I marked up the spacing I wanted and then marked a line through those marks with a speed square and drilled the holes with a 10mm bit. I used the drill press here to ensure that the holes were at a perfect 90-degree angle. Then I marked up 9mm either side of the line to indicate what would be the 18mm thickness of the plywood, and I used some hot glue to stick on another piece of wood to use as a fence, lined up with one of those lines. I trimmed off the excess at the bandsaw, and that was the jig ready to use. Then with the 10mm drill bit in my drill, I added some tape to indicate the depth that I wanted to drill the holes to accommodate the dowels. I could then clamp the jig in place to start drilling the holes. This jig would not only help to keep the spacing of the dowels consistent, but also ensure that the holes were drilled at a 90-degree angle. Once the placement of the holes was established, I could remove the jig and drill the holes to their full depth using the piece of tape as an indicator. I added some wood glue and used a mallet to seat the dowels. I wiped away the excess glue and then used my Japanese pull saw to cut the top of the dowels flush. After adding the rest of the dowels, I could move on to making the bracing pieces that would sit in between the two arms and support the seat of the chair. There would be 4 bracing pieces in total: a top, a front, a back and a bottom brace, and I ripped all of them to the same width as I'd used for the arm pieces earlier at the table saw. I set up a stop block at the miter saw and then cut all of the braces to length. They were all cut to the same length, which would be the distance between the two arms of the chair based on the dimensions from the drawing. 3 of the 4 braces would need an angled bevel cut along one of the long edges, and I used the protractor tool in SketchUp to figure out what those angles needed to be from the drawing. I'd cut the bevels at the table saw and I used my digital angle gauge to set the angle of the blade. I get asked about this tool each time I use it, so I've included a link to it in the description box below this video if you want to check it out. The front and back braces needed a cut with the blade at 83 degrees. I ripped off a small amount from those pieces to establish the angle, and I marked them up with a pencil so that I wouldn't get the pieces confused later. The blade was set to 71 degrees for the long edge of the top brace. That would support the back of the seat. And the final brace at the bottom didn't need any angled cuts. I'd used dowels again to join the bracing pieces to the arms of the chair, but first I needed to adapt my jig, so I added another fence to the other side of the dowel holes, and I held a piece of the ply that I was using to get the spacing correct between the two fences. With the second fence added to the jig, that enabled me to put the jig onto the end of the bracing pieces. I drilled the first hole just by holding the jig firmly in place with my other hand, and then I added a dowel to keep the first hole correctly aligned while I drilled the next 2 holes. Then I could remove the dowel as it had served its purpose. I did this to each end of all of the bracing pieces. Next I needed to drill the corresponding holes into the arms that the bracing pieces would fit into. So I measured and marked up the position based on the dimensions from the drawing, clamped the jig in place and drilled those holes too. The piece I'm drilling here is the bottom brace, so it was just centered to the bottom panel of the arms. Here I'm marking up for the front brace and repeating the process, and I did the same again for the back brace too. Then I added some wood glue and hit the dowels in place ready for the braces to be added. I used a mallet to seat the bracing pieces and then added some clamps to get the joints tight. One of the bracing pieces didn't quite go in straight for some reason, so I clamped on another piece of ply to straighten it out until the glue dried, and that worked well. So it's time to own up to a mistake I made when drilling the holes for the dowels into the arm pieces. I was conscious that it was really important that the dowel holes were mirrored on the inside of each arm piece so that all of the holes lined up correctly. And I got that right for 3 out of the 4 bracing pieces, but for the top bracing piece, I managed to drill the holes on the wrong side of one of the arms. I did have more than enough ply left over to be able to make a new arm, but I decided not to bother, mainly because this is a bit of a concept project anyway. So I ended up just filling those incorrect holes with some dowels, and it's a mistake that I will just live with. I left that for a few hours to dry, and then I brought the chair into the workshop. I could then glue in the rest of the dowels and add the other arm of the chair to the assembly. This took some fettling as it was quite difficult to get all of the 12 dowels aligned with the holes at the same time before the glue started to set, but I managed to get it all in okay in the end. And then I could add more clamps until the glue set. While the glue was drying on the frame, I could cut the remaining pieces to form the chair, which were the seat itself and the backrest. I cut off the amount of plywood that I needed to work with using my circular saw and then did the more accurate cuts at the table saw again. I could then glue in the seat panel, and again I added some clamps. For the backrest, I needed to cut one more angled edge for where it would meet the seat, and that would need to be cut at 78 degrees. I could then glue on the backrest, making sure that the angle at the bottom was seated properly against the seat panel. I drilled pilot holes from underneath, making sure to angle the drill bit correctly to match the angle of the backrest, and added some 50mm screws to each side to pull the glue joint together nice and tight and reinforce the joint. For where the backrest met the top brace, I just fired in 3 brad nails to hold it in place until the glue dried. These nail holes will later be filled, so they'll be almost invisible. With the chair fully assembled, I had lots of sanding to do. I sanded everything at 120 grit, sanding all of the faces, the dowel joints and the plywood edges to make them nice and smooth and ready for finish to be applied. I also sanded all the sharp corners by hand just to soften them and prevent the plywood from splintering. And I filled the nail holes with some wood filler and sanded off the excess once it was dry. I used my branding iron to apply my maker's mark to the back of the chair. For finish, I decided to use spray varnish. This brought out the grain really nicely. I did some wet sanding at 400 grit to denib the finish and get everything nice and smooth. I then wiped off the dust with a damp cloth and applied a second coat. I decided I'd make some simple cushions for the chair just to give it a more finished look, and I had some thin offcuts of plywood and MDF to use as a base for the cushions. After cutting the pieces to size, I could then use them as templates to cut some of this 25mm thick upholstery foam, using a sharp knife to cut the foam nice and clean. I already had some fabric which I'd used in a previous project. This came from some old curtains that I bought in a local charity shop. Ideally, you should use some wadding between the foam and the fabric to give a more professional result when upholstering things like this, but I didn't have any, so I just went with what I had to get the project finished. I can always make some better cushions later down the line. After securing all 4 sides using my air stapler, I trim off the excess fabric, and then I broke off the sharp corners of the sheet material using a knife, and then I can concentrate on getting the corners nice and tidy and tight.
I was watching a question and answer video from Keith Brown, and one of the questions that he answered was who he would like to collaborate with, and to be honest, it kind of surprised me that it was me, and so I left him a comment saying I'd be happy to. Sheet of plywood. So as you can see from the title, I decided.
So this build took around 2.5 days to complete. That excludes the time spent designing the chair. And the total cost was around £60 for the plywood and the foam for the cushions. The fabric I already had. I'm really pleased with how the chair looks. I wanted to design it to look simple, cool and modern, and I think I succeeded. It was quite a challenge, particularly designing the chair, which I'll cover in a separate video, and also the dowel joinery, which would have been much easier with a proper dowel jig or doweling machine, or even better would be a Festool domino. I wouldn't trust biscuit joints for this project as they don't provide enough strength, or any strength in fact, based on the results from my testing video, which I did a few months back. I'll link to that video in the description box if you're interested. In the end, I used maybe 60% of a full sheet of plywood, so I have plenty of the hardwood ply left over, which I can use in future projects. It was such an honour to talk to and work with John Heisz on this project. His videos and his approach to woodworking have inspired me for so many years. So a big thanks to John, and thanks to everyone else for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please subscribe for more weekly woodworking videos.